Well, hello and good morning, everybody, wherever you are in the world. I hope that you are well. I was just waiting there to see the numbers trickle in to this event. Welcome to, and thank you for joining us today in our webinar on omissions and disputes under the FIDIC contract. My name is Paul Gibbons, and I'm one of the founding directors of Hewitt Decipher Partnership, with over 25 years experience in construction, representing employers, contractors, subcontractors, and acting as independent expert. Today we have over 350 registered for this event, and following the event, this webinar will be put on our YouTube channel. The webinar will consist of a panel discussion, which I will moderate, and we would welcome any questions that you may well have, so please put them in the chat, and if we have time, then we shall put them to the panel and perhaps answer them accordingly. If we don't have time, then we'll take them offline and then we will answer them separately. So I am pleased to be joined today on the panel with Paula Boast. She is a partner at Charles Russell Speechlys. Paula is head of construction engineering and projects in the Middle East. She's been based in Bahrain since 2006 and specialises in construction projects throughout the region, in particular within Bahrain, Oman and Qatar. Projects that Paula has worked on include the Shangri-La Oman, the Bahrain National Assembly, the Doha Convention Centre and Reef Island. And Paula also assisted the Bahrain Ministry of Works in the drafting and publication to market of its first ever standard suite of construction contracts. So Paula, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm also pleased to be joined by Glenn Bull, who is a senior associate at Charles Russell Speechlys. Glenn is originally from Australia and has been with Charles Russell Speechlys in the Gulf region since 2014, specialising in construction, property and real estate development law. Glenn advises employers, developers and contractors on both contentious and non-contentious matters. And Glenn's practical knowledge of the real estate and construction industry, along with regional experience and expertise in the law, gives him the unique ability to focus on finding practical outcomes and commercial solutions for his clients. And I'm also joined today by Andy Hewitt, who's one of the founding directors of Hewitt Decipher Partnership. Andy has over 40 years experience in the construction industry, having worked on many iconic projects worldwide. He has lived and worked in the Middle East for over 20 years. Andy has held senior contracts, commercial and project management positions, and he has been involved in a wide variety of projects, including super high-rise buildings, hotels, shopping malls, desalination plants, airports, etc. Andy firmly believes that if claims and responses are handled correctly, they will not be elevated to disputes. And he is proud of the fact that almost all of the claims that he has managed personally have been settled amicably, and the avoidance of disputes are his priority. Andy is also well known internationally for education on, and training on claims and contractual matters, which he provides through Claims Class. So that is our panel audience. So we've got a great depth of knowledge there. So I just want to set the scene from my perspective. So in my experience, construction contracts around the world regularly end up in a dispute if the contract has not been administered properly. And when these disputes predominantly deal with delay matters, then there are protocols in place vis-a-vis the SEL protocol or the AACE protocol, which assist and can guide the parties. However, in the world of omissions, this often causes some confusion with some pitfalls that should be considered. And this can result in costly dispute resolution. So on the panel discussion today, our aim is to discuss with the panelists their experiences of omissions and how to ensure success from different perspectives, from the contractor's view, the consultant's view, the lawyer's view. And therefore we have two solicitors and a consultant expert on hand to give their views. So that's a bit of scene setting. So without further ado, I'll dive straight into the questions. So the first one I'd like to put to Paula, please. So Paula, omissions are a topic which cause a lot of confusion and difficulty for many. What do you believe what is it about evaluating omissions that make them so tricky in the first instance, please, Paula?
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Well, for most of you in the Middle East, it's good morning. If you're somewhere else, then good evening. The problem that we have with omissions is that the contract forms that we use, predominantly in the Middle East, put them in the category of variations, and they find a home predominantly under clause 13. We don't see much deviation away from that, even in bespoke contracts, such as, for example, mega plant EPCs. And by their very nature, they are variations to the contract. There's no doubt about that at all whatsoever in terms of the nature of them. It's the way that they operate that really causes the confusion and angst predominantly. And that's generally because the contracts haven't been drafted or amended in a particular type of way to deal with the way in which the parties want to deal with omissions. So that will be different for every project. You know, there's a very general assumption in FIDIC that it's a benefit that the employer can exercise, and that it will be measured and valued, and it will be all worked out, and that will be fine as by way of a claims process. The reality of it is that omissions can be used strategically. They can be used to save a client money. They can be used to hurt, potentially, a non-performing contractor. And when you get those types of differentials in a project, what you get rather unfortunately around omissions, from my point of view, whether you're a contractor or a client, is distrust about the way that the system works. And this will probably lead on to what Andy's going to talk to you about in terms of if you can get those claims right and you can deal with the communications around it correctly, then you stand a much better chance of coming out of your omissions phase in much better shape than when you went into it. The reality, however, is that most of the time the contracts are not prepped in a way that makes moving through the omissions phase sensible or coherent. The starting point that I often find for clients and contractors in particular is the correlation with fixed price lump sum in clause 14, for example, which automatically wipes out the measurement, which we normally see sitting in clause 12. And that's a very basic standard before you even get onto a sophisticated form of adapted or amended FIDIC contract form. So the problem with measurement evaluation is normally quite simply because somebody has mucked around with the drafting of the contract. It doesn't properly convey the way that the parties have agreed to deal with omissions, or there has been an imbalance of power in the signing of the contract in the first place, and all of the power generally ends up sitting with the employer. The contractor feels very much exposed, and that really develops that relationship of mistrust around it. Why are you omitting work? What are you going to do with that omitted work? Are you telling me the truth? Am I going to get paid for it? And on the client side, how can we take this work away from the contractor? And being very frank, how, in some instances, can we pass it very gently along to someone else if that's what we want to do with it? So the whole arena, it's a very small part of the contract drafting, but as an arena, it is one that causes a huge amount of consternation. And it is one that I have seen that can drive very deep divisions within contractual relationships. So it's a very serious area for us to be discussing today.
Thanks, Paula, for that really comprehensive response. That's really good. Thank you. Glenn, just moving on to you then. So what is the correct contractual situation if items are including in the drawings and specification are not including in the bill of quants and vice versa?
Yeah, thanks for this, Paul. It's a great question. Essentially, I think the first place to look is the order of priority of documents within the contract. This is where whenever there is a conflict between the two documents, that will set out the priority of which documents take precedence over the others. And in the FIDIC contract, this is set out on a standard basis at clause 1.5. And this puts the specifications in a higher priority than the drawings. And then below both of those documents comes the BOQ. So the BOQ does sit below the initial documents that you essentially are pricing and reviewing throughout the tender. A FIDIC contract, of course, will almost never be issued as it is in its standard form. Of course, here in the Gulf, it's practically unheard of. You will often be provided with a FIDIC contract that is amended very, very heavily. The amendments can exceed the number of pages of the contract itself, and that often includes this order of priority being moved around, rewritten, and this will either be done in the particular conditions or at the initial document in the contract agreement. The order of precedence in FIDIC's case with the specifications over the drawings and then both of those over the BOQ, I think is the right order. I think FIDIC got this right in this occasion. I think this really does set out I would say that switching this order or reversing this order could be problematic. But this does, of course, depend on the nature of the works and depends on the detail that's in the drawings and the specifications. So I think in the general case, so you're talking about IFT drawings prepared by a good quality design consultant, then I think the position of having the BOQ under those drawings is correct, because essentially the employer is putting those documents out in the tender to get a price for the contractor to carry out that document, those drawings, that project that's set out in the drawings and detailed in the specs. They're not just looking for a list of what the contractor will and won't do and the price for each item. So that's in the case of a lump sum contract, and the BOQ in that instance really is just a tool for calculating your payments, the interim payment applications, and a tool that's used by the parties to value the variations. So again, that's important to keep in mind. Obviously, that's different in a re-measurable contract. The BOQ really is important, but in those instances, you're only looking at the volume and the quantities that go into the works rather than the volumes and quantities that have been quoted. So I think that the way in which it's structured at the moment is correct. I think that always depends. Everything is on a case-by-case basis as the way construction is. And if you look into, when you are entering into a contract, check where they sit, and then check the detail that's set out in the drawings and specifications. And based on that, you really then need to prepare carefully your BOQ, price the items as accurately as you can, share the overheads, include, if you have an inaccurate BOQ and you have items that are overpriced, or items that are carrying a greater proportion of your overheads and your profits, then those items are at risk of being omitted and causing more harm and more cost to you than what is expected. Yeah. Super.
Thanks for that, Glenn. Andy, coming to you then, and I know that you've represented quite a few contractors in your time. So how should contractors, in your view, approach valuing emissions?
I'd like to, well, first of all, I'd like to just underline what Paula said, and Paula made a very, very valuable point, particularly in the Middle East, is that the FIDIC conditions are usually very heavily amended and usually done very badly. I mean, it's one thing amending a contract, it's then amending it, but usually wording that can be clearly understood. And to give you an example, the Red Book, which is invariably used in the Middle East, is by default a re-measurable contract. But inevitably, in the Middle East, the employers, the engineers, change that to a lump sum contract. Now, I think from memory, there's something like 12 clauses that need amending if you're going to change a red book from a re-measurable contract into a lump sum. And it's almost never done. So that leaves grey areas, and it leads to confusion, and it leads to the contractors looking at it this way, and it leads to the employers and the engineers looking at it another way. So, you know, just to underline, the work that you put in at the beginning of the project on drafting of the contract, right at tender stage, is invaluable through the rest of the life of the project. And we deal with disputes, all four of us on the panel, and how often do we get disputes caused by inadequately drafted contracts and ambiguities and conflicts? So thanks for that, Paul, a very valuable point. So how should contractors approach valuing emissions? It's not rocket science, you know, just remember the basic principles of whether it's a FIDIC contract or any other form of contract, is that if it's a re-measurable contract, the contractor will be paid under the remeasure for the work that he actually provides. So if that includes emissions from the original contract design or extra work, he will be paid for whatever he provides. And the quantities for the as-built situation will be evaluated generally using the rates and prices in the bill of quantities. So that's for a re-measurable contract. But as we know in the Middle East, we don't do that too much. We convert everything to a lump sum. And the principle that most people seem to forget is that, firstly, the bill of quantities is stated as being an estimate, both in FIDIC, in the red book, and generally in the other conditions that the employer includes in the contract conditions, because they don't like to stick their neck out and say these are accurate. They say it's an estimate. It's to be used for evaluating variations and for evaluating work in progress, and it is not to be relied on. So therefore, even if it weren't way down the priority list that Glenn spoke about, you can't have a document that means 100 that's purporting to be 100% accurate when it's stated as being an estimate and not being accurate. So the principle when either the engineer or the contractor is evaluating variations is what is included in the lump sum price. Throw the bill of quantities away and go back to the contract drawings. That is what you are deemed to have included for within the contract price. And if the bill of quantities bears little relation to that, doesn't matter. What you have priced for is what's on the contract drawings. So if we then get, and as Paula says, an emission is just a variation, an instruction to omit some work, we have to go back to the contract drawings, measure is a quantity surveying exercise, measure the work that's been omitted and apply the contract rates and prices. Finish. It isn't rocket science, it's a quantity surveying exercise. So thereby comes the value of your emission.
I mean, you hit a key point there, Andy, in terms of obviously having knowledge of the contract drawings and having those updated and working to the relevant revisions. And I guess that's where, you know, contracting organisations may suffer with the contract administration, but absolutely, it's getting that that assessment correct based upon the contract works compared to the original estimate that was put together. So thanks, Andy, for that one. Glenn, so just looking at it then through the eyes of the employer, do you see a difference in the way that they approach these types of issues from your experience?
Yes, Paul, thanks for that. You touched on it, I think, just a second ago by saying difficulties with the administration of the contract. And I think the role of the engineer when it comes to valuing the emissions from the employer's perspective is compromised. The employer's approach is obviously in these cases, it's bottom line. Paula even touched on other situations where perhaps it can be used to in a more sinister way, but essentially if the employer can get the same thing for a cheaper price, then that's what he'll do. Or if the omissions are being undertaken simply to overcome budget blowouts and other issues on the site, then of course he's going to try and reduce the price of the contract as much as possible. So when it comes to pricing omissions, the employer or the engineer carrying out those services will forget about the overheads that are included in the rates. They will be looking to reduce the price as much as possible, and something, you know, particularly obvious opposite of what you'll see when variations involve additional works. At that price, the rate set out in the BOQ is perhaps considered over, and the additional works should reduce the price, and market rates are tried to be pushed on to the contractors. So, you know, obviously commercial construction works is a transaction, and it's a very expensive one at that. So you can't really expect anything different to come from the contractor, from the employer when they're trying to do this. So FIDIC does take the opportunity, or gives the parties the opportunity to try and negotiate the impact of an omission. But then it comes down to the engineer to make a determination if that negotiation doesn't resolve in a resolution. And in doing that, he has to make his determination that's in accordance with the contract, that is fair and gives due regard to all circumstances. So this is a noble clause. It puts pressure on the engineer to do what's right. But the fact is, the engineer is paid by the employer. The engineer is often prohibited from releasing his determinations or making determinations on points that will increase or decrease the works, or increase or decrease the cost. And so the engineer is really jeopardized in these decisions, and the employer has a lot of control over what the engineer can release, and this just creates an essentially a bias that is difficult for the contractor to overcome. With regards to omissions, FIDIC does look to address these difficulties with clause 12.4, but again, whether that clause remains in the contract for a lump sum project is something that the parties have to draft specifically for. But at least then that does, again, require the engineer to look into these issues and make their assessment. It's more matters to take into consideration. But what I'll say about 12.4 is that it does put a very difficult burden on the contractor, and they have to be able to prove the impact that the omission is having over things just beyond the cost of those works and materials. And then this, in the end, being such a complex and intangible type of calculation, does leave the engineer with a large ability to essentially dismiss some of those claims or to disregard them in a way that perhaps isn't quite fair. And it's really only 12.4 becomes really advantageous to the contractor when the expert, someone like Andy, has been able to go onto the site, carry out a proper investigation, and then put out his findings in a detailed report that then is considered by an independent arbitrator, someone who is purely impartial. So yes, this occurs, but employers are playing with fire when they do take control over their engineers like this. They really are treading a very fine line as to whether or not they're creating a situation that will lead to a dispute. There is a fine line that I'm sure that they're always pushing towards, and that is the limit where the determination is in their favor. The value of those omissions works to their benefit, but only to the point where the contractor is not going to be enticed or forced to take the matter further into arbitration. So I think ultimately the employer and the engineer the engineer who is perhaps administering the contract poorly, unfairly, is siding with the employer too greatly, is not properly advising the employer as to the risks of him not acting fairly and judiciously in his role of making an independent determination, does create a big risk for the employer. And that does, you know, there is no benefit for them if the matter goes to arbitration, and the employer's determination is overturned. Yeah, so that's something they really need to try and avoid.
Thanks, Glenn. Andy, I think you might have already touched upon this part already, but just for clarification, if a bill of quantities provided with the tender documents is stated as being an estimate, what will the effect on the tender price on a lump sum contract be, please?
Yeah, this again, it's a typical thing in the Middle East. Developers and I think the consultants advising the developers or the employers, why do they change a perfectly good contract, i.e. a re-measurable contract, into a lump sum contract? Well, I am convinced that they think it's a cheaper way of doing it. But I'm also absolutely sure that it's not a cheaper way of doing it, because if you're given in a 3 or 4 week tender period that you're pricing a large job, something like a hospital or an airport, you don't have time to check whether how accurate the quantities are if you're given a bill of quantities. So you price whatever's put in front of you, because you literally don't have the time to do anything else. But any wise contractor will realize that there's a risk. You don't know how accurate the quantities are. So they will price that risk within their price. Now, if I were a contractor and I knew in 2 years' time, I will get paid exactly what I provided. If the bill of quantities says 1,000 cubic meters of concrete and I provide 1,001 cubic meters of concrete, I will get paid for that 1,001. There is no risk. So my price is going to be cheaper. So for many, many years, all these people that's been convincing themselves or been allowing themselves to be convinced that re-measurable is bad because it'll cost more, lump sum is better because it's cheaper. I'm sorry, but in my opinion, gained over 20 years in the Middle East, you are wrong.
Thanks, Andy, for that blunt response. That's good. Yeah, and that's the kind of advice people want to receive. So just touching on this is one, I guess, for Glenn and Paula, but so FIDIC is one of the most popular contract forms in the region, in the Middle East. What does the contract say about dealing with emissions? So if I put that to you, Glenn, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So we've touched on 12.4. That really, as I just said, it isn't overly helpful. It isn't overly prescriptive. It leaves the engineer with a lot of flexibility, and it places a lot of evidentiary burden on the contractor. As I said, margins for overheads and profits can be really difficult to prove, and really difficult on perhaps small discrete omissions, or matters, volumes of concrete that are enormous, and you're cutting percentages of those out. So therefore, it's easy for the engineer to disregard the proof that has been provided, or the submission provided by the contractor is simply not sufficient, and not sufficient to change his his decision on perhaps just using the quantities at the prices set out in the BOQ, if he's not convinced. And it's easy to be not convinced, or say that you're not convinced on these types of things. So that again, it just leaves that power in the hands of the employer, and it puts the burden back on the contractor to say, if you want to challenge this, then it's on you, because we've made our decision. So yeah, look, I think omissions, as Paula said, are treated as variations, and not much else, and that creates a big problem for it being dealt with fairly and properly. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Glenn. And Paula, with your practical experience, have you seen clients, or how have you seen clients dealing with emissions, the issue of emissions generally, please?
My clients tend to come from all spectrums of the projects industry. So generally speaking, clients, employers will try and use omissions as we'll try and use it strategically if there's a gain to be had. Contractors generally will practically deal with it as best they can from a kind of typical claims point of view. And what we generally end up with is a bit of a mishmash somewhere in the middle of probably how it should be dealt with. As I said earlier, it can be very contentious. So I think from a practical perspective, what I would like to say is this: don't think about omissions in the middle of your projects. And I'm pretty sure Andy will agree with me on this, because we agree on the drafting point. We agree on the BOQ pricing estimate sort of remit. If you want to deal with omissions, you have to start thinking about them as actually being risks in your projects, okay? They should be in there from day one on your risk register, because they are a risk. They're a risk for the employer and they're a risk for the contractor. You can debate all day about who carries the greater burden or level of risk on that, and it will depend on the contract terms, and it will depend what you agree to. So if you think of it as a risk, a building block of risk to be dealt with at the front end of the project, then employers, you need to look, as Andy says, at your pricing at the front end of the job. This idea that we take lowest price bids is really the starting point of all of our problems. And if we can move away from that, and we are seeing a move away from it, particularly more so in the private sector, where we get the quantity surveyors and we get the cost consultants out there doing their jobs properly and actually pricing the jobs for clients at the front end during the design phase as what the cost budget should be for the project. Okay, what we find very often is that, you know, the consultants are paid by the employer, much as Glenn said about the engineer. There's a real want for them to kind of shove the cost estimate into, you know, a lovely fluffy world of a target price, because that's how much money the client got from the bank for the funding. And really, it doesn't matter how much the contractor's going to price, because you're going to bend them down to that number anyway. If we can have less risk around that cost estimate deficiency at the front end by the client team, that would help immensely. Conversely to that, on the contractor side, stop pricing in your tender deficiencies. Omissions are not a way of getting those, and they are absolutely not a zone where you're going to get your tender deficiencies back, not in a million years. I know we'll probably talk at some point about the fabulous world of overheads, etc., and that just creates even more murkiness around the whole thing. But I think one area that we've not touched upon from a practical perspective is, what do you do about the time? Because it is a variation, and if you put in a claim for a variation, generally the idea is it's more work, you get more time. If you've got a decent, reasonable employer and a fair and reasonable acting engineer. What happens when someone takes that work away from you? We don't talk very often about the impact, then sits around 8.3, and the client will bundle around and they'll say, give me a revised program. Yeah, okay, I'll give you a revised program, but guess what? The time is condensed, or there's now more float, which can be helpful for a project depending upon its complexity. But we need to talk about the time aspect as well. And a question I get asked all the time, predominantly by contractor QSs, is, can I get time back in an EOT claim? Well, by virtue of it, it says extension. So the idea is, well, you can't take time back if you're meant to be extending it. I think there are very good reasons in the market. This will upset people. I think there are very good reasons in the market that if your omission is of a sufficient magnitude, that we really should be thinking about time coming out of the program. And if it's not coming out of the program and there's some saving or advantage also to the contractor in their operations, then we need to think about how we correlate that into float, or we save it to the point where then EOTs are then required through the project, and obviously the contractor is looking for alleviation from LDs. So there's another arena that sits around this, but I do think, practically speaking, if we deal with it more at the front end and we deal with those deficiencies in cost estimations, target pricing, lump sum, strangulation, as I like to call it, we would have less risk around omissions. But please, practically, try and treat omissions as a risk on your project. If you know, for example, that your client employer hasn't given you financial due diligence at the front end, it's probably an indicator that not all the finance is coming into this project when they've told you it's coming in. That's an omissions risk. I mean, the best line we get generally, there are two lines we generally get. We don't have funding for phase 2, so we're going to omit phase 2. What, the whole of phase 2? A bit of phase 2? You know, that's, if you price for a rather large project, that could be 50%, you know. So there are reasons why contractors get very, you know, upset and consternated about the whole thing. But then if a client is sat at risk and suddenly they've had their funding axed, they've got no choice but to start to omit portions of the works because they can't build stuff they can't afford to pay for. So there's a balance to be had really in there. How are we seeing people dealing with it at the minute? I would say the market's not too bad on the disputes remit around it. There are a lot of claims for omissions. And I think a lot of that is restructuring post-COVID. I think a lot of it is coming out of unavailability of materials and supply chain and equipment. I'm sure Andy's been seeing a lot of this in the claims that he's seeing coming through at his end. And we're going to start seeing and feeling those effects as we move through probably over the next 12, 18 months or so. Are they serious and concerning? Yeah, they are. Do they need to be tackled head on? Absolutely. Does the contract help you do that? Not always necessarily. But nothing ever stops you at the end of the day on a project sitting down and talking about these things, particularly when both parties are suffering from the same problem. So there's a lot to be said about good contract admin and good contract communication and dialogue to try and get you over the hurdle of these things, because the chances are you're both suffering a little bit and you need to resolve the issue and move on.
Thanks, Paula. That was really good. And you absolutely hit it on the nail in terms of the time element and how that gets dealt with in the program. And yeah, I guess there's some views in the audience as well on that. But moving on, the Glenn and I think this is one for Glenn and Paula really. From a legal perspective, what specific tactics are being employed in the Middle East that we should be wary of with regards to emissions? So any thoughts on that, please?
I'll give you the classic line. It's not an omission. It's just a variation. Honestly, that's what we hear engineers say. It's not an omission. It was never in your work in the first place. We never wanted you to do it. Oh, it was part of the contingency. Well, actually, really, it's a provisional sum. Well, no, it's not. It's quite clearly an omission of works. And it goes back to what Andy said. It's either priced in those drawings or it's not. It's either in that BOQ or it's not. It's included as a makeup for your schedule of rates or it's not. And I think one of the tactics we do get is where people try to lift the omissions clause out of the variation section of FIDIC in particular, and they try and give it a set clause section all of its own. They try to make it something else without wanting to acknowledge the actual nature of it, which is that omissions are variations to the contract. So we see some quite clever drafting around what omissions really are. I'm also seeing some actual sensible drafting around omissions where that risk that I talked about a few minutes ago is actually treated as a risk upfront. There is a possibility on this project that we may have to do some value engineering. We are going to do that at the following milestones. Dun, dun, dun. This may or may not result in variations to your contract, which may or may not include omissions. So there's almost a heads up going in there about how the parties are going to treat that and what that risk alignment looks like. So that's quite interesting to see that coming through at the minute, and that's quite good. I don't know if Glenn has anything else he'd like to add on.
Yeah, no, I think that's really progressive, really forward thinking, and without that, I think you then have to, as a contractor, look at what's been done to clause 13. Have they amended clause 13(1)(d), which prevents them from omitting works to then give it to someone else to carry out those works? You know, an easy tactic for an employer is essentially to shop around the BOQ and see if other contractors, smaller contractors, can come in and do aspects that have been quoted on simply by omitting them and having another contractor carry them out. So definitely one measure for contractors to to look at. It might not be something that you can change, but it's something you can take into account in terms of your risk calculation, is whether works can be deducted to then be carried out by someone else. Another thing is to look at whether or not the volume of omissions or variations is capped in any way. Is your contract at risk of being 50% descoped after signing? Or is there a cap that perhaps limits that to 10 or 20%? And then you can price the variation of that in your risk. Yeah.
There's one other aspect to this as well, which is we need to talk probably about the other risk in the market right now, which is that a lot of main contractors are struggling with subcontractors and supply chain. And a lot of smaller set subcontractors are struggling within the margins and operations of their own business right now. I've sat in a number of meetings over the last few weeks where subcontractors have come to the main contractor and said, we don't have capacity or resource to carry on with this subcontract. Please let us go and please replace us with someone else. And in turn, they're having to then revert back to the employer and say, there's a change in our subcontractor makeup because of these operational reasons. So there's a real impact being felt at the bottom end of the contracted chain at the minute. And I think we have to be cognizant of that, to the point where it may actually sometimes be in a main contractor's best interest for some work to be omitted, particularly if their current subcontractor, who may be an expert in one field or another, is actually incapable of carrying out the work. Because if you force him to carry on, or you as the main contractor pick up his work, which your team aren't capable or expertised in carrying out, you run the risk of being in breach of your contractual obligations. You run the risk of further delays, liquidated damages and penalties. And worse than that, if you really, really overstep the mark on your performance obligations, you risk the employer calling your performance bond, which is really not what main contractors need right now. So we do have this additional layer of risk sitting around those omitted works. So if an employer comes to you and says they want to remove something which it seems your subcontractor cannot deal with, and they have another subcontractor who quite clearly can, you may want to give sensible consideration as to whether actually stopping the bleed at your own end is actually the best thing for your contracting business.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. That's very valid in terms of looking at the overall position. And thank you. Just in terms of Andy, I'm just conscious of the time, and I know we got some questions on the chat, but just want to touch upon the overhead element. So this is one for you, Andy. Just in terms of, can the reduction of the quantities due to remeasurements, can that be considered as omissions under clause 12.4 of the FIDIC 99 to recover the contractor's under recovered overheads, which it is built within the bill of quantities rates? And if it is not, then how does the contractor recover their unrecovered overhead due to reduction in the quantities, when in particular there's a final contract price, and emphasize that, when it's not being reached to the accepted contract price, which includes the variation? So Andy, have you got any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, and I think, what's coming out of this is that this subject of emissions, and I'm going to go with Paula and just call them variations that have a negative financial outcome rather than a positive one, is that everything's different. Paula talked about, are we not going to do phase 2, which could potentially be a variation to admit 50% of the original contract price. Or it could be, instead of putting 100 windows in the building, we're only going to put 70 windows in the building. So there's a big difference between the type of variation. So what we have to do as a team, both sides of the contracting fence, is look at these sensibly and individually, see how the contract has really been affected. And, employers, engineers, fine, if you want to omit some work, if you want to make some value engineering services, savings or cost saving, or whatever you want to do, that's absolutely fine, it's your prerogative, but you need to treat your contractor fairly, and he doesn't need to lose out on it. Equally, we get both sides of the contracting fence. When something like this happens, they're both manoeuvring into position to see how can we get an advantage out of this. And in some cases, it's an unfair advantage. But if we look at overheads, if we look at the bill of quantities, we've got two sorts of overheads. We've got the site overheads, which the contractor pays for his site establishment, his management, his administration, his time-related costs, his officers, his standing plant, etc. That is usually priced within the prelims or general items of the bill of quantities. So that's a standalone price. Some of it's time-related, some of it is a one-off price for demobilization and mobilization. We then have, generally within the rates in the bill of quantities of the priced items, we have the contractors' overheads, and by this overheads, I mean head office overheads and profit. Now, the contractor's concern is if I have a significant amount of work taken away from me, am I going to lose out by that? Well, no, if you're getting your preliminaries and general items paid as per the price in the bill of quantities, that's your site overheads taken care of, whether the work increases or decreases. Of course, if it increases, you may be entitled to prolongation costs for an extension of time. But if it decreases, have you lost out on your site overheads? Generally, no. What you have lost out on is your overheads and profit because you're doing less work. Now, clause 12.4 in FIDIC sort of deals with emissions, but it doesn't deal with this particular situation. What it does do is say if the contractor has incurred or will incur any costs in relation to work that is being omitted, he can recover those costs. So, example, if he's done engineering, if he's procured some materials or something to be manufactured for the original scope of work, which is now being omitted, he can't lose out on that, so he can recover those costs, and the engineer needs to evaluate that fairly. So we then got a situation where he's doing maybe only 70% of the work in the original contract price, so potentially he's going to only get 70% of his head office overheads and profit. Can he claim for that, the percentage on that 30% that's been omitted? Well, FIDIC doesn't deal with it specifically, but legally there may be some, and I'm not a lawyer, I must defer to the experts in the room. There may be some legal ways of claiming for this, but as with everything else, if you are going to ask for some money, you need to ask for it in the correct way. And the correct way is to create a persuasive argument backed up by the contract or backed up by law and backed up with sensible, reasonable, well set out calculations, and ask for that money through, guess what, a claim. The longer you leave these claims, the harder it's going to be to get. So, but you know, it's not just a case of chucking some calculations at the engineer and saying, I want to recover this under recovery of the overheads and profit. It is a grey area. It's something that, to be honest, doesn't happen that often certainly on the majority of projects. It would be a rare occurrence, but the consequences on a large emission could be worth pursuing that claim. So it all depends on how you ask for it, and of course persuading the other side that it's a reasonable request.
Thanks, Andy. And Andy was just conscious, obviously, of the time, but there's another question here, and it's really looking at it through the eyes of the engineer. So I know that you've acted as engineer in the past. So I'll ask you this question. Can the engineer make recovery of over-recovered overheads by the contractor, which have come out of an increase in quantities to the bill of quants, as well as through variations and extension of time claims for the same durations? And if that is the case, then how should that be done in terms of the engineer assessing it?
Again, it's a tricky one. I think we've got to look at the individual circumstances. One thing that is applicable to the engineer looking at a what you might call an over recovery of overheads and profit, and also the contracts are looking at an under recovery. One of the vehicles you could build your claim on either way is the fact that under clause 12.3 in FIDIC, that allows the rates and prices in the bill of quantities to be changed if, and there are certain qualifications, I've made a note of this because I thought it might come up. Where are we? If the measured quantity changes beyond more than 10%, so we're talking about a significant amount, the change in quantity is multiplied by the rate exceeds 0.01% of the accepted contract amount, and the change changes the cost per unit quantity of the item by more than 1%. So if these conditions apply, you can say, I'm under recovering, or in the case of the engineer, Mr. Contractor, you're over recovering. So we need to look at a re-rate or a repricing of this particular item. And as I say, this is one of the hooks that you could possibly hang your claim to recover loss of overheads, because we are now making less overheads and profit. We need to enhance our rates on the remaining work so we can still recover that amount. Just a question for the lawyers, and please, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what does the law say about, we've entered into a contract, we expect to make this amount of overheads and profit, we're now doing less work. Does the law say we should make the same amount of overheads and profit, or should it be adjusted proportionally for the work that we're now doing? Like I say, I don't want to put you on the spot, but quick answer.
You've got two limbs on that, or two kind of legal schools of thought. And each of the civil codes in the Middle East treats them slightly differently, but on principle, it comes back to reasonableness and fairness. The first one is something akin to what us English or British people will know as unjust enrichment, which is your recovered, unrecovered kind of zone. And I think part of the problem that we have here is that very often the perception is that whatever the contractor puts in is inflated anyway. That's always how an employer is going to approach that. Even if he has the most fair and reasonable engineer on the planet, the client is going to automatically assume there's a degree of inflation in there. The contractor on the flip side is going to work from the assumption that he never recovers everything from the employer that he feels is fully entitled to. Probably a little bit of fluffy margin in there. So there is probably a little bit of come down. And I would actually, going back to what you said, Andy, when you're putting those claims in, be sensible, be reasonable. Don't give the engineer room to argue with your numbers. Give him the data in black and white. Make sure it's substantiated. And it's very difficult for him to then deal with the facts on a piece of paper. When you start to embellish or be creative around those numbers, that's where you start to get into hot water. And that's where the law doesn't like you very much, and it will clip your wings. So there can be circumstances where there is very good reason for recovery, under recovery, over recovery, whatever category we want to put it in. The other thing that comes into play quite a lot is this sense of a commercial burden. And I normally use the Arabic words for it, but they escaped me this morning. But within the codes, there is generally coverage for contracts which become so commercially burdensome for one party or both parties that actually the law gives you not necessarily an exit route, but certainly the ability for the judiciary to look at the commercial contract and to see where changes can be made to particular aspects of it, which are causing the burden. And omissions by way of variations, if they are significant enough, I mean, you talked about 10, us lawyers have a margin kind of around 15% where we start to view that as being material or significant. But anything between that and up to losing 50% of your job, there's a commercial burden there, and it is very likely that the law will look at that for you and try and find a slightly more workable solution. So there are aspects of the law that support positions around it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Andy. We've got a number of questions in the chat, some of which we've already responded to. Just a couple though, again, just conscious of the time, we are slightly just running over. Just one for the lawyers, just in terms of, can the employer change the priority of the documents? If yes, then how will omissions be dealt with? Just one for Glenn or Paula?
Yeah, they can. It has to be done before the contract is signed, obviously. So that's a decision that they can make. I mean, Andy points out that the BOQ is an estimate, and so moving the BOQ higher in the order of priority can create difficulties because the drawings aren't estimates, but they can. And how that deals with omissions, it will depend on what's been omitted and everything else that's in the contract regarding 12.3, 12.4, and the whole facts and circumstances around the omission. But yeah, absolutely, the employer can reshuffle that clause, the order of priority, as he can amend the whole contract substantially. And I've seen some of the questions and queries about 12.3 and 12.4. We've talked about the advantages of those clauses, but when they're marked as not used, that's another ability that the employer has to vary the contract to suit him, and that's contracting.
And I think just harking that back to, we warned about earlier about how omissions can be used strategically and not in a good way. When you get tender documents and you then get contract documents that are appended to the contract, please do check them to make sure they actually are the same form and content. You may have initialed them 6 or 9 months ago, but I have seen a number of specifications over the years that actually include references to potential omissions down the line of products or particular portions of work or technical specifications sitting against those portions of work. And contractors don't check them. They assume that that specification is the same one that was in the tender documents. They assume that it correlates with what's in the drawings, which they then assume it correlates with what's in the BOQ. So as a front end, going back to that risk assessment on day one, make sure the documents that you're signing, if you have to live with the priority that the employer is imposing on you, check that it correlates in terms of that omissions risk. And you might find that the word omission is in more documents than you had believed there to be in the first instance.
Thanks, Paula. Just one final question from the chat before we close the session, because we are running out of time. Is there any standard method or guidance to evaluate cost and time impact of disruption on the project due to the employer's actions around emissions? What are our thoughts on that? Glenn, do you have any thoughts, or Andy?
I was looking at Andy, actually. I thought he was, yeah.
That's funny you should say that, Glenn, because I was looking at Paul, who happens to be a bit of an expert on disruption and delay.
Sorry, go on, Paula.
I think the issue goes back to what I said earlier. We all keep talking about the variation that comes out of it itself. We're all concerned about the money. But in terms of the time, generally speaking, at the point of omission, we're not retrospectively looking backwards in terms of delay analysis here. We're looking forwards. Yeah. So we actually want to be looking at it on a progressive, forward-looking analysis basis. And very often that's actually technically should be a pretty straightforward exercise because you're removing activities from the critical path. You should be able, certainly in the first instance, working off your baseline program, you should be able to come up with a revised program which accurately reflects what the program now looks like with that portion of work removed. So for anybody out there who's panicking that they've got to put in some big fancy delay analysis into that claim, I don't think in the first instance that you probably do, unless it is something that is of that significant magnitude. I don't know whether you agree or not, Paul, but that's generally how I see it dealt with.
No, absolutely. And I think just to add to that, the SCL protocol, 2nd edition 2017, deals with disruption very cleanly. And it really unpacks the disruption element and what parties should be doing. So I would advocate, no matter where you are in the world and whatever contract you're on, that gives you some good guidance. Not legal authority, it's just guidance how to deal with it properly through the eyes of the employer and the contractors. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're fast coming up to an hour session. there are lots more questions in the chat. We will respond to them separately, directly after the event, to those that we haven't answered in person today. I would like to thank the attendees for all attending this session. I think we had over 133 at one point, I just checked. I'd also like to thank the speakers for giving up their time this morning. I know we're all very busy. It takes time to prepare for these sessions. So thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Andy. I'd also like to thank Annie from Limeslade for facilitating this session today. So thank you very much for Annie for doing that. And I wish you all very well. As I say, this session will be on the YouTube channel. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Excuse me. There's been lots of debate. We could have gone on for a lot longer, I'm pretty sure. But I wish you all very well and take care for now. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.